And welcome to Advantage Radio Ministries and welcome to Second Chances here on Lift FM. This is our weekly program in which, if you know Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, then you do understand that our God is a God of second chance. Come to think of it, third, fourth, fifth chance, many chances actually. And the reason we put this program on each and every week is to bring you people from all different walks of life, all of which are doing things to glorify God and the kingdom. And in addition to that, they all have unique stories to share. And we are privileged to have another wonderful guest with us today on Second Chances. Her name is Melissa Wiltrout. She is the author of the book, Tessa, From Fear to Faith. Actually, it's a novel. And Melissa, thank you for joining us here on Second Chances.
Hello.
And
thanks for having me.
We appreciate you joining us. Now, you're located in Wisconsin, is that correct?
Wisconsin, yes.
So tell us, are you originally from Wisconsin? Were you born there? Things like that?
Yeah, I was born and raised in Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin. I work at my family's nursery and landscaping business in the warmer months of the year. And I also volunteer at the local arts center where I sell tickets, run the spotlight for shows. And again, in the warmer months of the year, I enjoy gardening, spending time with my dogs outside, folk dancing. Right now, we're kind of in a deep freeze. I'm staying inside.
Yeah, well, I can tell you, Melissa, that we can relate to you at the time we're recording this program here in New Jersey. Reason is, this is extremely cold for us here today. We are about 15 degrees for the high, and I know compared to what you normally go through there in Wisconsin, that's probably a Sunday in the park, but to us, 15 is pretty scary.
Ha ha ha.
So
you had minus 19 here last night.
My goodness. As far as you say that the nice weather months, just out of curiosity before we get into the program a little bit, Wisconsin, what are the nice warm months? I know I've been to Wisconsin, and I went in August, end of July, beginning of August. I went to a place called Hayward, Wisconsin, and at the end of that trip, it was getting a little chilly at night there. So what are the nicest months there in Wisconsin as far as warm temperatures?
Nicest months, it's going to start about the middle of May, and it's going to run into the middle of September in a good year.
Okay, all right. So is that kind of the months that you're involved in your family's landscaping and nursery business?
Yeah.
Okay. So Melissa, tell us a little bit about yourself when you were younger and how you came to know Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior.
Okay. Yeah, I was actually raised in a very sheltered Christian home. My parents essentially homeschooled me, so I didn't have a lot of contact with the rest of the world. We didn't have TV or anything like that. I grew up hearing about God and what He expected of me, but I didn't really realize that God loved me. I thought being a Christian was all about me being good. And the trouble was, I found being good was really boring. I wasn't able to ever really be good enough, it seemed, for God or my parents. So I got to be about 11 years old, I just quit. I wanted to find adventure in my life, and being quite isolated, I found my adventure by starting to fantasize about forbidden things like drugs and crime and violence. And my fantasies were very exciting, and so I did more and more of them, and it wasn't too long before they completely took over my life. By the age of 14, I was fantasizing 24 hours a day, every day, and I didn't have any genuine relationships with anybody. I pretended I was a criminal. I did my best to look and act and think and feel like one. And, of course, this showed in my behavior. For one thing, my self-esteem fell so low that I stopped taking care of myself. My parents, of course, realized something was wrong, but they didn't know what it was, and I wasn't going to tell them what it was. I desperately wanted to do drugs or be a criminal, just ruin my life. But I couldn't do it because I didn't have any connections. I was too sheltered. But my fantasies continued to thrive, and by the age of 20, I wasn't able to hold them inside any longer. I started trying to live them out, and my life quickly got out of control, as you might guess. I started huffing gasoline, cutting myself, among some other things. I couldn't walk into a store without wanting to steal things. I had a very rebellious attitude toward laws and authority. Every time I saw a policeman, I would cuss at him. I knew I wasn't a Christian, and I was terrified of going to hell. My Christian upbringing taught me if I'm not saved, I'm going to go to hell. And I didn't want to go to hell, but I didn't want to change either because I don't want to be a good, boring person. I still felt it was impossible for me to be good. In the middle of this mess, I started listening to a Christian radio program called Unshackled. And that's where I heard the gospel of grace for the first time. I heard that Jesus had paid for my sins and done everything necessary to make me completely acceptable to God. And all I had to do was accept it. It sounded pretty crazy to me, but I realized that was my only chance if I wanted to turn my life around. So I took God up on that. I asked him to help me believe just simply like a little child believes, and I prayed, and something happened. I knew beyond a doubt that Jesus had come into my heart, and I was saved.
Now, back to that time when you were feeling led to steal, to cut yourself, to sniff gas and inhale it and things of that nature. You'll often hear people that have come out of a sinful way and have been set free by Jesus Christ, talking about they felt like there was this spirit, this demonic force that was kind of pushing them, and the further they took a step forward, that demonic force continued to take them further and further away from what was right and what was wrong. Was that the case for you, that you just felt like you were being led and pushed further and further away from what was right?
Not exactly. It was more like, there was something leading me to, I wanted to be bad. So maybe that would be that same thing. I wanted to be bad. I didn't want to change, and that would lead a person on a downhill journey pretty fast.
Now, once you decided to take Jesus up on his grace and opportunity to be set free, what happened in your life? Was there immediate changes?
Only for a little while. Maybe 2 weeks, 3 weeks, my life was like wonderful, and then my way of thinking was still really messed up, and my old habits started returning, and I wanted to be good. I wanted to do what was right, but it seemed like I still didn't have the power to do it, and it really frustrated me. I couldn't seem to change, and my inability to change frustrated me even more. So I prayed a lot. I said, God, help me, deliver me, change me. I don't want to keep living this bad way, and I'm caught and I'm stuck. There were some breakthroughs, but a lot of the time I felt like I was fighting a losing battle. And it was in the middle of this mess that I started writing my book, Tessa. I believe now that God inspired me to write the book, but at the time I thought it was just a whim. But it was that writing that book, the research I did to write it, that enabled me to turn my life around.
The prior to starting to put things down to write a book, which you originally mentioned you thought was a whim, Had you ever, prior to that, ever had any desire to write anything, such as a novel, a book, or anything like that?
I enjoyed writing. Um, I would write. I was writing a diary. I probably had about 400 pages done in my diary by the time I started writing this book, but that was just about me and about my grievances about the past. And I I was pretty good at English in my schooling, so writing came easily for me, but I never seriously thought of writing a novel, no.
Mm. Now, the book is entitled Tessa From Fear to Faith. And I guess the first obvious question about the book, uh, the title Tessa From Fear to Faith, uh, was there just a random pick of a name, Tessa, or did you base it on somebody that you came across in your research?
It was a random pick. I wanted a name that would maybe make a person picture a girl that was kind of tough, and somehow the name Tessa sounded kind of tough to me.
Okay, so the fact that you had been through some things, I'm sure, gave you an opportunity to kind of look at someone who's in fear, because I imagine when you were going through some things in your life, you were going through some fear. So I imagine that probably helped you a little bit. Am I correct?
Um, the book is actually completely fictional, but I based it on the sorts of things I used to fantasize about. You know, if somebody has spent 12 years fantasizing about drugs and crime and violence, that's probably what's going to come out when they start writing a book, and that's what happened.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's the kind of stuff that's in this book that sets the stage. It is a story of redemption, but it starts out pretty bad, and then it follows Tessa from living in fear of her abusive father to faith and freedom and forgiveness and a lot of good things. My life story is completely different from what I wrote in this book, but it kind of parallels it in a way, because I was fantasizing about all this stuff, and then God led me into freedom, and I wrote about, well, the way God led me into freedom, then I led Tessa into freedom the same way.
Mm. Now, you mentioned as a child growing up, you were very sheltered. Just to give us an example so we can all relate to what very sheltered is. In other words, you didn't really leave your inner family. Is that what you mean by sheltered?
Um, yeah, there were 4 kids in my family, and we were kind of a unit. We didn't really see any relatives. We didn't see any friends. We didn't watch television or movies. We didn't listen to any music unless it was Christian music of a certain kind. We didn't really go anywhere except grocery shopping. So, yeah, very sheltered.
Did you attend a church as a child?
We did not.
Oh, okay, okay. A lot of times, if you're a Christian growing up in a Christian home, you'll go to church, and obviously you'll have interaction with some of the people at the church. So, speaking of sheltered kids, obviously coming from a sheltered home such as you did, do you think it's a good idea, a bad idea to have sheltered kids?
Uh, yeah, that's a good question. I think, having thought about it a lot based on my experiences, I think parents really need to carefully weigh how much they shelter their kids. Of course, God expects parents to protect their children, but I think if they do too much of it, the kids end up missing out on some important lessons. In my case, I never saw for myself the bad consequences of things like drugs and crime, so I came to believe there weren't any. So it is true that sheltering kept me out of trouble for a time, but it also set me up to make some really bad decisions when I was about 20. So I guess I would say shelter your kids, but not too much, especially when they get older.
Did your other brothers and sisters, you mentioned there were four of you, did any of them have the struggles that you faced as well?
No, they had struggles, but we were all different in what we struggled with.
I see. Um, Once you learned the truth that there were serious consequences to doing wrong, what was it that caused you to? Um, was there any? I guess what I really want to know is there any consequences that you really faced because of some of your wrongdoings?
Probably the worst thing I faced was a really messed up mind, and I did have quite a struggle with the self-injury thing, too, that kept getting worse and worse. It's actually an addiction, and I wasn't able to break out of it for quite a few years. Um, that was one of the worst things I ever let into my life, and I'm really thankful that God delivered me from it, but for a while I thought I was going to have to go into treatment or something.
We're visiting with Melissa Wiltrout. She is the author of the novel entitled Tessa, From Fear to Faith. And Melissa, before we go any further with the interview, we're a little over halfway through it. For those that are joining us and saying, boy, this is a novel I'd like to pick up, I'd like to learn more about it, is there a website that one could visit to maybe perhaps obtain a copy of the novel, or to perhaps learn more about you and what you've been through as an author?
Yeah. A listener could get my book as either an ebook or a paperback. It's on Amazon. It's on Barnes & Noble. They could also get it from my publisher at www.lifesentencepublishing.com. I would also invite people to visit my blog at www.mychroniclesofhope.blogspot.com. There's links there to purchase the book, and I'm working on listing some resources, and there's a little bit about me on there, too.
Okay, one more time, the blog spot is, one more time?
www.mychroniclesofhope.blogspot.com.
That's www.mychroniclesofhope.blogspot.com, and also Life Sentence Publishing, you said .com, as well as Amazon?
Yes.
Okay. Tell us a little bit about your novel, maybe a little overview of it, and then a little bit about the storyline, if you could.
Sure. I'm going to start out with the storyline. Tessa, From Fear to Faith. It's the story of a teenage girl who's caught in an abusive family situation. Her father forces her to help him cook meth, which is an illegal drug. And meanwhile, Tessa's mother looks the other way and pretends nothing's going on, everything's fine. Tessa thinks the only way out of this mess is to run away, so she does it. But running away doesn't work very well because her father always finds her and brings her back, and things are worse than before. Of course, Tessa thinks life would be great if her father wasn't there. And what she doesn't realize is that she's becoming more and more like him. For instance, she has a very rebellious attitude toward laws and authority, and she justifies stealing from her mom and shoplifting from the store, and she doesn't regret it except when she gets caught. And like most people who've been abused, Tessa doesn't trust anybody enough to let them get close and try to help her. Now, of course, I didn't actually live out the events of this story, like I said before, so I had to do a massive amount of research in order to write a really accurate, credible story. So this is where I started learning the truth about the consequences of the way I was going, and it was very good. I started reading biographies of abused kids. I spent whole evenings learning about methamphetamine. I got into the Wisconsin state statutes, and I read whole chapters of the criminal code, finding out what should happen to my bad guy in there. I toured a prison. I toured the local police department. I attended actual court hearings. And over a period of 6 years, I took all this research and I put this story together, and then I infused it with my own emotion. And the result was a compelling and extremely realistic story. It almost reads like a biography. It'll draw you into experience Tessa's world firsthand for yourself. And there's a lot of ugly things in Tessa's world, drugs, illegal activity, fear, loneliness, abuse, abandonment. It looks like there's no hope and no way out. But with God, there's always hope, even for the worst situations. So that's what my book, Tessa, is really about. It's about hope. It's about finding forgiveness and healing. It's about experiencing real change in your life through Christ. Because, God's love can change anybody. So the story is fictional, but I can personally testify that the message of hope and freedom in there is true, because I experienced it working in my own life, giving me victory in the things that I was caught in while I was writing the book.
We're visiting with Melissa Wiltrout, the author of the novel Tessa, From Fear to Faith. And obviously, Melissa, as you mentioned, you did quite a bit of research on the topic of child abuse. And I imagine, among other things during your research, you probably learned to the extent that this is a problem. How big of a problem is this, Melissa, here in America?
It's a lot bigger than I thought it was. It's actually a huge problem. Here in America, we've got the worst record of all the industrialized nations. There are 3 million official reports of child abuse every year, and that involves more than 6 million children. And of course, there's a lot of cases of abuse that are not reported, so I think it's safe to assume the problem's even bigger than that.
Is there a difference between, what is the difference, I guess I should ask, between physical discipline and abuse, and where do you cross the line?
Yeah, that's a good question. Abuse is always going to be seeking to control the child using fear and force, where discipline seeks to teach him and correct him. Abuse harms a child. It leaves him with emotional scars, nightmares, bruises, all kinds of problems. Discipline doesn't do that. Abuse can be unpredictable. It often happens for no reason at all, whereas discipline is a direct response to a child's willful disobedience. Now, in thinking about the difference between these two, I realized something. I think it's very important for parents to be in tune with what their child's abilities are, and they don't want to discipline them for not doing something if it's something they're not able to do. If you have a baby and you tell him, stop crying, and then he doesn't stop crying, and you punish him for not stopping, you're being abusive because that baby can't stop crying. So I think those are some of the differences.
Understood. We have just a couple minutes, and I want to get to a couple of things here real quick, so if you could keep these next couple of answers on the shorter side, we'd appreciate it. How can a person tell if a child is in an abusive situation? Some warning signs?
Well, of course, if you see or hear something happening or the child tells you, but also frequent unexplained injuries, fear of going home or being alone with a certain person, feelings of worthlessness, difficulty trusting people or forming a good relationship, shying away from touch, and all kinds of emotional problems like anxiety, depression, or anger. Those could all be signs that a child was being abused.
Melissa, if someone picks up the novel Tessa, From Fear to Faith, what would be the message you'd like your readers to gain from the novel?
Well, there are so many people like Tessa in the world. They're abused, messed up people. A lot of times they have a tough look about them. They're in trouble, but inside they're hurting, they're lonely, they desperately are in need of God. And I want to help Christians realize that as the children of God, we are qualified to minister to the people around us. We don't need degrees in counseling to share God's love. It says in the Bible that God likes to reveal his power through people who are weak. So that's why in the story I used an ordinary plumber and his wife to bring hope and healing to Tessa and her family. And I'd like to see more of that going on in real life.
One of the things you mentioned a few minutes ago really leads us to the final portion of this program. The most important portion of the program is to give our listeners that are ready to surrender their life to Jesus Christ, to change their ways, to let him lead, guide, and direct them, to give them that hope that you were talking about a few minutes ago. We want to give them the opportunity to do that, Melissa, and we would be honored if someone has maybe been in a situation of abuse, or maybe has been in a situation like you, where they're wanting to do evil things, hurt themselves, cut themselves, shoplift, things like that. Maybe they're ready to be set free. Melissa, would you lead us in a word of prayer and give those listeners that are ready right now the opportunity to be set free?
Yeah, I'd be glad to.
Please do.
Jesus, I know I'm a sinner. I accept your word that my own way of life is completely sinful and leads only to death. I can't change myself, and there's nothing I can do to earn your gift of salvation. So I come to you just the way I am and ask you to save me. Jesus, I accept you and your payment for my sins. Come into my heart and take away all my sin and give me your perfect life. Thank you, Jesus. Amen.
Our guest has been Melissa Wiltrout, the author of Tessa, From Fear to Faith, the novel. And Melissa, one more time, if someone would like to learn more about the book, about you, your blog spot, what are those web addresses, or to obtain a copy of a book?
Yeah, the book can be gotten from Amazon or Barnes & Noble. It's also available from my publisher at www.lifesentencepublishing.com. And there are also links on my blog at www.mychroniclesofhope.blogspot.com.
Melissa, we'd like to thank you for being a guest here on Second Chances.
Yep, thank you for having me.
Tune in next week for more Second Chances right here from Advantage Radio Ministries.